Chapter 1. The quietest afternoon. There are villages in England that seem to exist outside the passage of time, where life unfolds according to gentle routines. And every face is familiar. St. Aldhelm's was just such a place, quaint, nearly untouched by progress, where secrets traveled only as far as the hedgerows, with its thatched cottages, labyrinth of cobbled lanes, and the quiet dignity of its Norman church. St. Aldhelm's felt almost too picturesque to bear the weight of real trouble. On this particular Thursday in May, the annual spring fete bloomed like clockwork across the vicarage green. Bunting in faded Union Jacks fluttered in the mild breeze, while the scent of cut grass mingled with the sweet promise of jam tarts. Elderly gentlemen leaned on walking sticks by the cricket pavilion, watching the younger boys set up wickets, and ladies in straw hats clustered around the jam and preserves table, each determined that this year her Victoria sponge would earn first prize. Miss Jane Marple, seated comfortably beneath the shade of a striped canvas awning, surveyed the scene with apparent mild interest. Her needles clicked softly as she worked the heel of a woolen sock, a gift for her great-niece in Devon, or so she claimed. In truth, Miss Marple was less interested in knitting than in watching. She had learned long ago that even the smallest village teemed with drama if only one cared to look. She watched the fate unfold as if it were a play, each participant sliding into their roles. The vicar, Reverend Chudley, hovered anxiously by the tambola, conscious of his wife's formidable fundraising expectations. Mrs. Chudley herself, resplendent in turquoise linen, greeted arrivals with wide-armed enthusiasm, collecting coins and promises of donations with equal zeal. Mr. Jessup, the grocer, was deep in conversation with Mrs. Blenkinsop, who always brought her spaniel, despite repeated warnings about dogs and trifle. The air was thick with gossip about the new schoolmistress's progressive ideas, about who had pinched last year's best roses, and about the mysterious new family at Honeysuckle Cottage, who kept strictly to themselves. But it was Alice Pilbeam who drew Miss Marple's quietest attention. Alice, 11 years old, with hair the color of damp straw and eyes the pale, startling blue of forget-me-nots. She drifted through the fate in the manner of someone not quite tethered to the earth, silent and solemn, rarely meeting anyone's gaze. She spoke so infrequently that some of the children whispered she could not speak at all. Miss Marple had her doubts about that. She had seen Alice in the churchyard, talking softly to the robins, or moving her lips as she traced the names on the old gravestones. There was something watchful in the girl-in alertness that belied her apparent passivity. Alice's aunt, Mrs. Pilbeam, was a narrow woman with sharp elbows and a face like pursed parchment. She bustled Alice from stall to stall, tugging her sleeve, issuing whispered instructions. "Don't dawdle, Alice. Mind your manners. Touch that, for heaven's sake." To the villagers, Mrs. Pilbeam presented a face of brittle composure. But Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened on Alice's wrist, the brief shadow that crossed the girl's face at each rebuke. At the lemonade stand, Alice paused, staring down into the pale yellow liquid as if divining something in its depths. Miss Marple watched her for a moment, unnoticed, until Mrs. Pilbeam swooped down like a magpie, hissing something under her breath. The girl flinched, her hand brushing the rim of a porcelain cup, sending it tumbling to the grass with a faint clatter. No one else remarked upon it, but Miss Marple tucked the detail away with all the others around the fete. Laughter burbled and flowed. Children chased after the maypole ribbons. Mr. Cresswell dozed beneath a hat the color of faded rhubarb, and Miss Dawes, the new schoolmistress, organized a knot of little girls in a skipping game. Miss Dawes, Miss Marple observed, had a tendency to look over her shoulder, as though expecting a summons. She was young, with anxious eyes, and seemed eager to please, yet uncomfortable among the older women. The village, for its part, was divided about her. called her a breath of fresh air. Others, less kindly, wondered how long she would last as the sun slid westward. Sense of easy familiarity settled over the green. Yet Miss Marple, sensitive to the currents beneath such scenes, felt a tremor of tension, a note of unease, just out of reach. There had been more arguments than usual at the Women's Institute, more complaints about missing apples, and the postmistress had confided, in strictest confidence, that a certain sum had gone missing from the collection box. No one had accused anyone yet, but in St. Aldhelm's, small things festered in the shade, and old resentments found new life. The fate reached its crescendo with the drawing of the raffle. Mrs. Chudley's cheeks flushed with excitement, called numbers as Mrs. Pilbeam stood by, clutching Alice's arm as if she might float away. Number 39. "Oh, do come up, dear." Miss Dawes, startled, accepted a tin of shortbread with nervous gratitude, while behind her, Mr. Jessup jostled for a better look at the prize hamper amid the revelry. Alice's absence became a ripple in the pattern. Mrs. Pilbeam, intent on her own conversation, did not at first notice. It was only when the vicar's wife, scanning the crowd, asked, "Where's that quiet little Pilbeam girl?" that anyone realized she was gone. A search began casual at first, then more urgent. The Fates' laughter faltered, replaced by sharp calls and anxious glances. Miss Dawes was the first to spot her, standing near the old yew tree at the far end of the churchyard, her face whiter than the lace on her frock. Alice Pilbeam lay on the grass, limbs twisted awkwardly, eyes wide and unseeing. There was a stillness about her that spoke, in the most chilling way, of finality. Miss Dawes covered her mouth with her hands, unable to move. Within seconds, a crowd gathered. Someone screamed high, reedy, piercing the quiet like a pin through velvet. Mrs. Pilbeam pushed forward, hands clawed, faltered at the sight of her niece's stillness. Miss Marple set aside her knitting, rose, and made her way in hurried, yet purposeful, toward the scene. She noted, as she passed, the subtle choreography of shock and disbelief on the villagers' faces, the way Mr. Jessup's jaw worked, the tremble in Miss Dawes's hand, Mrs. Chudley's frantic attempts to organize and reassure. She knelt, briefly, beside the child, one gloved hand resting gently on Alice's small, cold fingers. No pulse. The girl's lips were parted, as though in the act of speaking or, perhaps, of trying to scream. Miss Marple looked up and saw, in a single crystalline instant, the entire village reflected in the mirror of that horror. Every secret, every lie, every small cruelty was suddenly illuminated in the harsh afternoon light. The village fate, that fragile illusion of harmony, had shattered. The peace of St. Aldhelm's was broken, and beneath the surface, Miss Marple sensed the first stirrings of guilt and fear. She straightened, expression unreadable. To most, she looked only a little pale, a little sad. But in her mind, 100 threads had begun to weave together the girl's silence. The aunt's sharpness, the nervous flutter in the new teacher's eyes, the missing money, the whispered complaints no one noticed as Miss Marple quietly surveyed the grass near Alice's body, or the faint impressions where someone's shoes had trampled the wildflowers, or the small scrap of blue ribbon half buried in the earth dot above. The bells of St. Aldhelm's tolled the hour, and the villagers, for the first time in years, wondered if they had ever truly known their neighbors at all. The first act of the tragedy was complete, and in the heart of the village, Miss Marple alone understood just how much darker the days ahead might become. The whispers began. The sun had not yet dipped behind the church tower, but already the mood on the vicarage green had changed. The Fates' bunting drooped in the still air, abandoned and forlorn. A few stray children's ribbons fluttered near the maypole, caught and twisting in the light breeze. As though unsure which way to turn, it was not long before the arrival of Dr. Penrose, the village physician, summoned from his afternoon game of whist at the club. He hurried across the churchyard in shirt sleeves, the lines in his brow deeper than ever, case in hand. The crowd parted for him, some faces hopeful, most resigned. Mrs. Chudley wrung her hands and dabbed at her eyes with the corner of her apron, while Mr. Jessup muttered that it was a wicked thing for a child to be taken so sudden. Miss Marple stood slightly apart from the main knot of onlookers, knitting bag dangling from her arm, her composure undisturbed. She watched as Dr. Penrose knelt beside Alice's body, his movements brisk but gentle. He checked for life, though it was clear from the set of his shoulders that hope was already gone. After a moment, he shook his head gravely and drew the small, limp form a little straighter, covering Alice's face with a neatly folded handkerchief produced by Mrs. Blenkinsop, who sobbed quietly into her spaniel's fur. The silence that followed was thick, punctuated by the distant caw of rooks and the hollow toll of the church clock. Finally, the vicar cleared his throat, voice ragged with disbelief. We must fetch the constable," he said, turning to Mr. Jessup, who hurried away, eager to be useful. The word police traveled in uneasy ripples through the crowd. It was not often needed in St. Aldhelm's, and it always carried with it the taint of scandal. People clustered together in little knots, their voices hushed but urgent. Rumor in such places breeds faster than any weed. Within minutes, stories were budding. "I saw her near the orchard earlier, by herself. She was never quite right. Poor thing, not since her mother died. Do you think she might have eaten something? One of those mushrooms?" Mrs. Pilbeam stood apart, rigid and dried, her face set like flint. She held a crumpled handkerchief, but did not use it. Instead, she watched the gathering crowd with a look that was both proud and wounded, as though daring anyone to meet her gaze. The rector's wife hovered at her side, offering whispered condolences that seemed to slide off Mrs. Pilbeam's shoulders like rain from slate. Miss Dawes, meanwhile, was gently ushered away from the scene by Mrs. Chudley, who guided her to a bench and pressed a cup of lukewarm tea into her trembling hands. The schoolmistress sat, pale and silent, staring fixedly at her lap, her knuckles white around the teacup. A small group of women surrounded her, half comforting, half interrogating. "I'm sure you did all you could, my dear," Mrs. Chudley murmured, her voice heavy with implication. "You noticed nothing strange? No one hanging about? No other children, perhaps?" Miss Dawes shook her head slowly. "She was just there, by the yew. I didn't see anyone else. She didn't cry out. She never did." The circle of listeners exchanged glances. The village had always found Alice's silence unsettling, a thing to be explained or excused. Some said she was delicate, others that she was backward or touched. Now, that silence loomed in their minds, mysterious and possibly incriminating. Mr. Cresswell, woken abruptly from his nap, shuffled over with a bewildered air. He was elderly and rather deaf, but word of disaster always reached him eventually. "Who's gone then?" he asked, blinking in the sunlight. When told, he shook his head and muttered, Well, it's poor little mite. But these things don't just happen. No, indeed." He peered around, suddenly suspicious, as though the culprit might be lurking behind a trestle table near the lemonade stand. The older children huddled in uneasy clusters, swapping half-remembered tales and ghost stories. "She was cursed," whispered one, voice barely audible. "Saw her talking to the gravestones." Another bolder declared, "She was always watching us. Maybe she knew something she shouldn't have." Their talk twisted between pity and fear, seeding a dozen tiny anxieties. Miss Marple, though seldom the first to speak, was often the first to be consulted. By virtue of her age, her gentle manners, and her prodigious memory, she was a natural confidant in times of village distress. But now she merely listened, standing near the churchyard gate as the first evening shadows lengthened. Her eyes, keen beneath their mild blue gaze, moved from one villager to another, cataloging reactions, tones, even the direction of a glance. She noticed how Mrs. Pilbeam rebuffed Comfort, shrinking from the vicar's wife, but watching the faces around her with steely intensity. She saw Miss Dawes's trembling, the stiffness in her posture. Mr. Jessup returned from the telephone box, his face flushed. "Constable's coming, he says. He'll bring an inspector from Market Basing, just in case." There was a collective intake of breath at this inspector, as though the village itself was now the scene of a crime novel. Dr. Penrose, after some whispered consultation with the vicar, stepped forward to address the crowd. "There will have to be an inquiry," he said, voice pitched low and grave. "No outward sign of violence, but that doesn't rule out, well, certain things. If anyone saw anything at all unusual, you must speak up. Best not to speculate before we know more." But of course, speculation was as inevitable as breathing. As the doctor moved away, Mrs. Blenkinsop leaned close to Mrs. Jessup. "You know, she was never quite normal, that child." And the Pilbeam swelled. "There's talk, isn't there? Money troubles. Arguments in the cottage late at night. Poor girl, never had a chance." The other woman nodded, glancing sidelong at Mrs. Pilbeam, who stood alone, a pillar of granite among shifting sands. Miss Marple, meanwhile, strolled quietly along the edge of the fete, pausing to observe the places where Alice had last been seen. The trampled grass by the lemonade table, the spot near the yew tree, wildflowers pressed into the earth. She bent to pick up the forgotten blue ribbon, considering its frayed edge. On the ground nearby, a faint mark of scuff, perhaps from a shoe larger than Alice's own, caught her. Nothing to most, but she tucked the ribbon into her pocket all the same. The constable arrived as dusk began to seep into the hedgerows. He was a stout, red-faced man, clearly discomfited by the solemnity of the scene. After a few quiet words with Dr. Penrose and the vicar, he set about cordoning off the area with a length of laundry line and began to take statements, pencil scribbling furiously in his notebook. Mrs. Pilbeam was first. Her voice was sharp, controlled. "I was with my niece all afternoon, except for a moment when I was called away by Mrs. Blenkinsop. Alice was quiet, as always. She never wandered off, never. I want that understood." Her jaw clenched on the last word, as if daring the constable to doubt her. Miss Dawes followed, her account fragmented and halting, the memory of Alice's stillness still fresh in her mind. The other villagers queued politely, offering what they knew or what they imagined they knew. The night crept closer, the air thickening with the scent of dew and cut grass. The fete, once a scene of bright banners and laughter, was now a tableau of uncertainty and suspicion. Children were gathered by anxious parents. Voices dropped to hushed murmurs. Someone extinguished the lanterns. The village of St. Altelms, for all its tranquil facades, was suddenly a stranger to itself. Miss Marple lingered near the church porch as the constable finished his interviews. She watched the villagers disperse in twos and threes, each burdened by fear, confusion, or the guilty knowledge of secrets best kept hidden. Only the faint echo of the church bells remained, and the whisper of wind in the yew as the last of the crowd melted away. Miss Marple looked once more toward the darkened green. There would be talk tonight, and tomorrow, and for many days to come, but the truth, she knew, would not be found in gossip or suspicion. It would be somewhere quieter, somewhere overlooked, and so the village waited. Not for answers, but for the shape of their old life to return to shape. As Miss Marple knew would never be quite the same again. Chapter 2, Threads in the Quiet. By morning, St. Altelms seemed to have aged a decade overnight. The fates, debris tattered bunting, a forgotten skipping rope. Crumbs from what had been celebratory cakes littered the green, now strangely silent. A fine mist clung to the lanes, softening the edges of the world, but nothing could muffle the restless pulse beneath the village's surface. Everyone in St. Aldhelm's awoke with the same question, one they would not utter aloud. How could such a thing happen here? The constable had spent most of the night patrolling his bicycle lamp, a lonely firefly on the village lanes. By dawn, a police car from Market Basing had arrived, bringing with it Inspector Venn, whose thin mustache and clipped vowels spoke of city service. He conferred with the constable by the churchyard gate, while the curious and some not so curious found reasons to be nearby. In a place like St. Aldhelm's, even the gentlest scandal was magnetic. But this, so stark and so close, gripped every conversation with a chill hand. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual, and after a solitary breakfast of tea and toast, she set out for the grocer's under the pretext of needing more ginger biscuits. She passed the vicarage where the blinds were drawn and voices could be heard in muffled conference. She noticed Mrs. Blenkinsop in her garden, pruning roses with unusual vigor, her face set in grim determination. A subtle tension hung in the air. Everyone, it seemed, kept glancing over their shoulder or pausing just a moment too long at a window at the grocer's. The bell above the door tinkled, and Mr. Jessup looked up with wary eyes. The shop, usually bustling on a Friday, was quiet, just Miss Dawes, pale and wan, selecting tea, and Mrs. Chudley murmuring to herself over the price of flour. Terrible business, Mr. Jessup said quietly, weighing out sugar. Can hardly believe it. Miss Marple. Not our Alice. She was a quiet one. Wouldn't hurt a fly. Miss Marple nodded, her hands folded neatly around her shopping basket. Often it's the quiet ones who notice more than they let on, she replied softly, her gaze drifting past the rows of tins and preserves. Mrs. Chudley, sensing an audience, drew herself up. I do hope the inspector is asking the right questions. There are those in this village who've always seemed a little well odd. You mark my words, Jane. It's never the ones you expect. Miss Dawes dropped her tin of tea. It clattered to the floor, rolling beneath the biscuit display. She stooped hurriedly to retrieve it, her hands trembling. Miss Marple watched her, mind ticking over details. Are you quite all right, dear? She asked gently. Yes, thank you. Just tired, Miss Dawes replied, not meeting her eyes. She hurried out, leaving her change on the counter. Outside, the village green had become a makeshift headquarters. The constable's bicycle leaned against a lamppost, and Inspector Venn stood in conversation with Dr. Penrose, his notebook in hand. They spoke in low voices, occasionally glancing toward the yew tree, now roped off with police tape. The spectacle attracted a silent audience, Mrs. Blenkinsop from behind her hydrangeas, the postmistress peeking from her doorway, and, at a distance, Mrs. Pilbeam herself. She was standing by her gate, arms folded, gaze unwavering. If grief weighed on her, it showed only in the set of her mouth and the stiffness in her shoulders. The villagers gave her a wide berth, as if sorrow and suspicion were equally contagious. Miss Marple walked by, pausing briefly. If there's anything you need, Mrs. Pilbeam. Mrs. Pilbeam's voice was low and cold. Thank you, Miss Marple. I have all I require. But Miss Marple did not move on immediately. I imagine the inspector will have questions for you. Again, these things take time, you know? Cues. Sometimes, in time, memories return small things that seemed unimportant at the time. Mrs. Pilbeam's face tightened. If I remember anything else, I shall say so. Alice was all I had. She never went off on her own, never disobeyed. I don't see how. She trailed off, pressing her lips together, then turned away abruptly. Miss Marple watched her go. There was no weeping, No visible breaking. Just a fortress of composure, as rigid and closed as the stone cottages lining the green. The morning wore on. In twos and threes, the villagers found their way to the church, drawn by habit or the need to be seen. Some lit candles for Alice, others knelt in stiff-backed silence, heads bowed more from discomfort than devotion. The vicar's sermon, hastily rewritten, spoke of innocence and the mysteries of suffering. Miss Marple noted who was present and, perhaps more importantly, who was absent. Among those missing was Mr. Cresswell, who, according to Mrs. Jessup, had taken to his bed with a funny turn. Young Freddie Dawes, the schoolmistress's nephew, was likewise nowhere to be seen, a detail remarked upon by several. Mrs. Blenkinsop confided to Miss Marple in a whisper. He was always following Alice about, you know. Sensitive boy. Bit too fond of secrets, if you ask me. As the day unfolded, Inspector Venn's presence grew ever more visible. He visited the Pilbeam cottage, the schoolhouse, and the bakery, his questions probing but polite. He asked about Alice's routines, her friends, her enemies, none, it seemed. In the events of the previous day, Miss Marple watched the inspector with careful interest. He was thorough, she admitted, but there was something brisk, almost impatient, about his manner. He listened, but it was clear he had his own ideas about how such things should be done. He questioned Miss Dawes at length, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. He spoke to Mrs. Pilbeam for nearly half an hour, leaving her more closed than ever. He also called on Miss Marple, inviting her to sit for a friendly chat. Over weak tea in her sitting room, he asked gentle, leading questions. Had she noticed anyone lurking about? Did Alice ever seem fearful or withdrawn? Had there been quarrels? Perhaps a family dispute? Miss Marple responded with calm honesty, offering what little she knew, but also slipping in a question or two of her own. I suppose you've spoken with Mr. Jessup, she said, pouring tea with a steady hand. He has an excellent view of the green from his shop. The inspector's eyes narrowed slightly. Indeed, he mentioned nothing unusual beyond the usual fate goings-on. If anything occurs to you, Mrs. Marple, no matter how trivial, do let us know. Miss Marple inclined her head. Sometimes the trivial is not so trivial after all, Inspector. I've found that in life, as well as in knitting. When he had gone, Miss Marple set aside her knitting, her mind humming with questions. She replayed the events of the fete in her memory, the sharp edge in Mrs. Pilbeam's voice, the shiver in Miss Dawes's hands, the murmur of children's gossip about curses and secrets. She remembered the blue ribbon still in her pocket and the scuffed patch of earth near the U. She made a note to visit the spot again at dusk, when the village's watchfulness would be softened by approaching night. Before she did, she called on Mrs. Blenkinsop, ostensibly to return a borrowed gardening book. Their conversation, pleasant on the surface, circled delicately around the fate and its aftermath. It's shaken us all, Jane, Mrs. Blenkinsop said, arranging a vase of snapdragons. I hardly slept a wink. You know, there's talk, there's always talk, isn't there? But this feels different. Like we're all waiting for something terrible to happen. Miss Marple sipped her tea, nodding. Sometimes, when something terrible has happened, it lets loose the old things, the things people hoped to keep buried. Mrs. Blenkinsop glanced sharply at her. You think it's someone here? One of us? Miss Marple smiled her gentle, ambiguous smile. I think, in villages, people often know more than they realize, and sometimes secrets have a way of coming out, despite everyone's best intentions. As she left, the bells of St. Aldhelm's rang out over the rooftops, their melancholy echo lingering long after the last note faded. The day was closing, but for Miss Marple and for the village the search for truth was only just beginning, and somewhere in the quiet, threads were being drawn together. Secrets watched from the shadows, and the girl who never spoke again seemed to whisper silently for justice. Shadows casting Spectre Vin's second morning in St. Aldhelm's dawned with a heavy sky. The clouds, thick and gray, promising rain. The mood of the village seemed to match the weather. Conversations were brisk, faces pinched, and the usual friendly greetings felt subdued. Even the sparrows kept to the hedges, as if unwilling to witness what was to come. The inspector's routine had already become familiar. He started at the Pilbeam cottage, notepad in hand, then worked his way methodically along the row of cottages bordering the green. His presence, though polite, was as unwelcome as a draft in winter, and the villagers, so practiced at gossip, now guarded their words with a wary vigilance inside the Pilbeam home. Mrs. Pilbeam received him with her usual rigid poise. Her hands, however, betrayed her, the knuckles bone-white, the teacup rattling faintly on its saucer. Inspector Vin's questions were patient, persistent. Did Alice ever speak of anyone following her? Was there anyone in the village with a particular interest in the girl? Had Mrs. Pilbeam herself noticed anything amiss on the day of the fete? No more than anyone else, she answered, voice brittle. Alice was a quiet child, timid, perhaps, but obedient. She knew to stay close. I watched her always. There was a tremor in her final word, quickly suppressed. The inspector did not press her about rumors about late-night arguments, about raised voices drifting from the cottage after dark. Not yet. He was saving that for later. For now, he thanked her and moved on, his sharp gaze lingering on the dustless mantel. The row of family photos, in which Alice smiled only faintly, as though never quite at ease. As word of the inspector's visits spread, so did unease. Doors were closed more quickly, curtains twitched more often. Yet, as always, news traveled. By midday, most of St. Aldhelm's had heard that Freddie Dawes, the schoolmistress's nephew, was being spoken to at the police station in Market. Basing Freddie, just turned 14, was a slender, awkward boy with a sullen air and a fondness for mischief, though nothing, so far, beyond pilfered apples or schoolboy pranks. Yet the fact that he had not attended the fete and had not been seen since had not gone unnoticed, nor had his habit, whispered about 4 months, of trailing after Alice as she walked home from school. In the schoolhouse, Miss Dawes sat at her desk, face drawn, hands clenched on a stack of untouched marking. Inspector Vin sat across from her, his tone gentle but unyielding. "You're certain your nephew was at home the whole afternoon?" "Yes," she said, too quickly. "He's a difficult boy, Inspector, but not violent. He has no friends here, not really. Sometimes he'd walk the lanes alone, but that's all." He admired Alice. She was quiet, like him. The inspector's brow furrowed. "You didn't see him during the fete?" Miss Dawes hesitated. "No, I assumed he was at home, reading. He often is." The inspector closed his notebook with a soft click. "If he returns, please let me know at once." Outside, the village buzzed with speculation. Some, led by Mrs. Blenkinsop, were eager to believe Freddie Dawes was the culprit. Boys, today, you never know what they'll do. If he was sweet on Alice and she turned him down, others shook their heads, remembering Alice's shyness, her tendency to avoid the other children, and the lonely path she so often took across the green dot. It did not escape Miss Marple's notice that, with Freddie absent, tension swung easily to Miss Dawes herself. Mrs. Shudley confided to her husband, and half the parish, that the young teacher was never quite comfortable here, never properly settled. Someone else mentioned the foreign postmark on a recent letter of hers, and how she never spoke of her life before arriving at St. Aldhelm's. Miss Marple, for her part, found herself once again on the vicarage green that afternoon, knitting in hand, watching as Inspector Venn conferred with the constable and Dr. Penrose under the shadow of the old yew tree. She observed the comings and goings with her usual composure, noting every detail, the way Mrs. Pilbeam glanced through her window but never emerged. The small group of children who lingered near the police tape, daring one another to step closer, and the elderly Mr. Cresswell, looking out from behind his curtains with a worried frown. At length, Miss Marple rose and wandered over to the group of children. "Such a sad thing, isn't it?" she said gently. "Did any of you see Alice?" Near the yew tree, before the fete ended. A girl with Platt's Maisie, the baker's youngest, looked down and shuffled her feet. "She was there. I saw her, but she wasn't alone." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose, ever so slightly. "Oh, who was with her, dear?" Maisie shrugged, casting a nervous glance at her companions. "I dunno. Someone tall. I just saw from far away, and then I ran off, 'cause Mom called me for cakes." "Someone tall, you say?" Miss Marple repeated quietly, tucking the detail away. "That's helpful, Maisie. Thank you." As she walked away, she met Dr. Penrose, who paused to speak in hushed tones. "I've had a look at Alice's records. She was never sickly, but there were a few odd bruises last year. Spoke with Mrs. Pilbeam, but she said Alice was simply clumsy." "It's not uncommon in children, I suppose?" Miss Marple nodded, her gaze distant. "Children do fall, but sometimes they're pushed." The doctor regarded her carefully. "I'll leave the clever work to you and the inspector, Jane. I only wish I'd seen more. Sometimes the signs are there and we're too busy or too comfortable to notice." She thanked him, but her mind was already elsewhere, sifting through the mounting fragments. A missing boy, a secretive teacher, a grieving aunt with a fortress of composure, and now a vague figure lurking in the periphery. No one seemed quite as they appeared by evening. Word came that Freddie Dawes had been found wandering the lanes outside the next village, clothes rumpled, eyes red from weeping. At the police station, Key confessed to fully and in fits and starts that he had left home to avoid the fate altogether, ashamed after a quarrel with his aunt. He swore he had not seen Alice that day. The inspector, eager to close the net, pressed hard, but Freddie stuck to his story. There was no evidence to contradict him. Reluctantly, Venn let him go, though with a warning that he must not leave the village. As darkness fell, the gossip continued. Some villagers remained convinced of Freddie's guilt. Others looked sidelong at Mrs. Pilbeam, or Miss Dawes, or even Dr. Penrose's recent widowerhood had been the subject of whispered speculation. The shadow of suspicion now stretched over the entire green. Long and uncertain, Miss Marple sat by her bedroom window, watching as lights blinked out in cottage after cottage. She considered the day's discoveries, the small shifts in the tapestry of the village. The first suspect had emerged and faded again, yet something deeper still eluded her, a motive or connection that would make all the small, strange details fall into place. She reached for her notebook, jotting down 3 lines. Blue ribbon, frayed, tall figure by the yew, Alice's bruises, last year. And she wondered, with a pang of sadness, just how many secrets lay curled in the dark corners of St. Aldhelm's, waiting for the light. Chapter 3. A detail in a dust rain arrived in the early hours, sweeping across St. Aldhelm's in relentless sheets, rinsing the cottages and lanes clean of their late spring dust. By mid-morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a hush broken only by the persistent drip from the eaves and the song of a lone blackbird perched atop the church spire. The air felt heavy, expectant, as if the entire village was holding its breath, awaiting revelation or reprieve. Miss Marple awoke to this stillness, her mind already at work before her feet touched the braided rug beside her bed. She moved through her modest house with habitual efficiency. A cup of strong tea, sensible breakfast, and then the deliberate donning of her hat and raincoat. The events of the fete and the uncertain days since weighed upon her, Somewhere amid the grief and gossip, she was certain, lay a truth that was both obvious and hidden, waiting to be uncovered by careful observation and a patient mind. As she made her way toward the green, Miss Marple noticed how the storm had altered the landscape. Puddles mirrored the pewter sky, and the grass where Alice had been found was flattened, muddy, marked by the tread of many boots. The village itself seemed to shrink from its own shadow. Doors opened less often, voices dropped lower at the approach of a neighbor. At the edge of the green, Inspector Vin and the constable stood conferring beneath a dripping chestnut tree. They glanced up as Miss Marple approached. The inspector's manner polite but distracted. "Good morning, Mrs. Marple," Vin said, snapping his notebook closed. "You're up early, as ever." "One sleeps poorly in times of distress," she replied, her tone gentle. "I wonder if I might look at the spot again where poor Alice was found. Sometimes, after the rain, things come to light that might otherwise remain hidden." The inspector hesitated only a moment before nodding. "I suppose there's no harm. We're still waiting on word from the lab in Market Basing, but I don't expect much. No sign of poison, nothing overt. It's all rather frustrating, if I may say so." Miss Marple gave a sympathetic nod. So often, the truth is small, barely noticeable. Not unlike the clues in a knitting pattern, a missed stitch, an unexpected knot. She walked carefully across the wet grass, taking care not to disturb the area any more than necessary. Kneeling at the base of the U, she examined the ground, her gaze flitting from one small detail to another. There, among the muddle of footprints, was the trampled patch where Alice had lain. Beside it, something pale and out of place, a tiny, broken object half buried in the mud. With gloved fingers, Miss Marple retrieved it, a button small, pearl-like, with a faint chip at the edge. She turned it over in her palm, considering it was too fine for a child's cardigan, and not quite the sort the men of St. Aldhelm's wore. Miss Marple's mind immediately began sorting through the villagers' wardrobes, Mrs. Pilbeam's starched blouses, Miss Dawes's serviceable dresses, the vicar's ancient waistcoat. No clear match came to mind, but the button was too singular, a detail to dismiss. She slipped it into her pocket and straightened, her knees protesting. Across the green, the inspector and constable still spoke in quiet tones, occasionally glancing in her direction. Miss Marple walked past the line of trees bordering the green, noting the way the earth bore the faint prints of a small heel, and, beside it, a much larger one, deep, narrow, a man's perhaps, or a tall woman's in sturdy shoes. Turning, she nearly collided with Mrs. Blenkinsop, Apps, who was making her way to the churchyard with a small bouquet of wildflowers. The woman started at the sight of Miss Marple, then gave a nervous smile. "Jane, you startled me. I thought everyone would be inside. What with the weather?" "I needed some air," Miss Marple replied. "'Kay, and I find the rain brings up the secrets that dust hides." Sis Blenkinsop shuddered, casting a glance toward the yew tree. "It's dreadful, isn't it? I keep thinking of Alice. So quiet, so alone. You don't suppose she did it to herself? Some children are. Well, you know." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Children may be lonely, but seldom are they so final, Mrs. Blenkinsop. There is usually something, or someone, that pushes them." The woman's cheeks reddened. "Well, I wouldn't know about that. People talk, but talk is cheap." She hurried on, flowers clutched tight. Leaving Miss Marple with a thoughtful frown, she moved on, stopping at the shop for a fresh loaf and a few kind words with Mr. Jessup, who looked as if he hadn't slept at all. "Can't believe the inspector's so set on young Freddie Dawes," he confided. "The boy's a handful, but he's not wicked. Some in this village would pin the crime on anyone to put their minds at ease." Miss Marple agreed, thinking of Freddie Powell, awkward, adrift in a village that had never quite welcomed him. She considered the chipped button in her pocket, wondering whose garment bore its scab. In her mind, she reviewed the fate once more. The swirl of dresses and trousers, Mrs. Pilbeam's severe suit, Miss Dawes's navy cardigan buttoned tight at the throat, Mrs. Chudley's turquoise linen with pearl-like buttons at the cuff. After leaving the shop, Miss Marple made her way to the schoolhouse. The playground was empty, the swings glistening with rain. Dawes answered the door, eyes red-rimmed but guarded. "Mrs. Marple," she said quietly, "is there something I can help with? I thought you might like some company." Miss Marple replied, smiling. "These are hard days, and sometimes a cup of tea can help steady one's nerves." Reluctantly, Miss Dawes let her in. The room was tidy, smelling faintly of chalk and damp wool. They sat at the table, steaming, mugs between them. Miss Marple's gaze fell on a mending basket near the fire, where a navy cardigan lay neatly folded. She noted, with mild interest, that the top button was missing. "I'm afraid I'm not much company," Miss Dawes admitted, staring into her tea. "It's all so sudden. I keep thinking I should have noticed something." But Alice was so quiet, she didn't mix. The other children teased her, sometimes. I tried to watch over her, but there are so many needs, so many small sorrows in a school. Miss Marple listened gently. "You did what you could, I'm sure. Still, small things can have great significance. A missing button, a harsh word, a kindness overlooked." Miss Dawes looked up sharply. "Button," Miss Marple smiled. "A silly thought. I found one near the yew tree after the rain. I dare say someone lost it in the confusion." Miss Dawes glanced at her cardigan, then shook her head. "I lose things all the time, Mrs. Marple, but I wasn't near the yew that afternoon. At least, I don't think so." Their conversation trailed into silence, punctuated only by the sound of rain against the panes. When Miss Marple left, she paused on the threshold, turning back to look once more at the cardigan and the mending basket outside. The clouds began to thin, promising a hesitant return of sunlight. Miss Marple returned home, heart heavy but mind alive with new connections. She wrote in her notebook, "Button, pearl, found by you, cardigan at schoolhouse, missing button, large footprint. Men's or sturdy woman's shoe, the village of St. Aldhelm's continued its quiet mourning. But beneath the surface, the truth crept forward, shy and slow as a hedgehog in the dusk." Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the returning sun slant through the clouds, and wondered whose secrets the rain had truly washed clean. Secrets on the surface, the first hint of summer drifted into St. Aldhelm's on a breeze heavy with the scent of wet earth and budding roses. The rain had passed, but its effects lingered. Grass greener, air cleaner. In the mood of the village, while not lifted, had shifted. Something had cracked in the facade of neighborly calm. Where there had once been whispered conjecture, there was now a sense of watching, of uneasy anticipation. It was Miss Marple who first noticed how the villagers had begun circling one another, drawing lines in the invisible sand. She sat at her usual perch by the bakery, knitting laid aside in favor of a book she barely read. From there, she watched as Mrs. Blenkinsop avoided Mrs. Pilbeam on her way to the post office, and as Mr. Jessup and Dr. Penrose exchanged tense, quiet words outside the chemist. The vicar's wife, usually a force of cheerful organization, appeared shrunken, her smiles brittle and perfunctory. The police, too, had changed their approach. Inspector Venn, once methodical and aloof, now moved with a sharper urgency. His questions were pointed, his manner brusque. He visited the schoolhouse again and again, speaking not only to Miss Dawes but to the children, one at a time. He called on Mrs. Pilbeam in the early morning and late at night, never quite catching her off guard, but each time leaving with more lines etched into her face. Word spread quickly of his persistence, and with it came speculation. Some whispered that Mrs. Pilbeam was hiding more than grief. Others wondered if Miss Dawes had told the whole truth about her nephew Freddie's whereabouts. Still others pointed quietly at Dr. Penrose, who was said to have prescribed laudanum to Mrs. Pilbeam after her sister's death, and who had, it was noted, seen Alice for a nervous complaint the winter before. Miss Marple listened to it all, filing away facts and fictions alike. It was in this atmosphere, restless, suspicious, and ready to fracture, that the first real confrontations began. The schoolyard accusation, it happened, as such things do, on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday morning. Miss Dawes had called the children in from play early, her nerves frayed by Inspector Venn's third visit that week. As she dismissed them, she caught sight of Mrs. Blenkinsop at the gate. Lips pinched, eyes narrowed with purpose. "I'd like a word." "Miss Dawes," Mrs. Blenkinsop said, voice pitched high enough for several mothers to overhear. "About that boy of yours." Miss Dawes bristled, color rising to her cheeks. "Freddie is not to blame for what happened. He has told the inspector everything." "Has he?" Mrs. Blenkinsop countered, folding her arms. "'Cause Maisie says she saw someone tall near the yew tree with Alice. Tall and with dark hair. Your nephew is the tallest child in the school, and he's always lurking about. It's unsettling." Other mothers drew closer, the circle tightening. Miss Dawes's hands shook as she smoothed her skirt. "Freddie is not, he wouldn't." Mrs. Blenkinsop cut her off. "There's something else, isn't there? That girl was frightened. You must have seen it." For a moment, it looked as though Miss Dawes might burst into tears, but she straightened, voice trembling but clear. "If you have a real concern, Mrs. Blenkinsop, take it to the police, but I will not have my nephew tried by gossip." Alice was a lonely child, yes, but she was not afraid of Freddie or of me. The women stared at her, uncertain. Mrs. Blenkinsop pursed her lips, then turned away, dragging Maisie behind her. The others drifted off, some with sympathy, others with suspicion. Miss Dawes watched them go, then retreated into the empty schoolhouse, where she sat in silence for a long while. Miss Marple, who had watched the encounter from across the lane, noted every word, every gesture. She saw the tension in Miss Dawes's shoulders, the guilt in Mrs. Blenkinsop's eyes, and the relief, however brief, that passed over Maisie's face as the confrontation ended. 2. Dr. Penrose's regret tour that afternoon. Miss Marple called on Dr. Penrose under the pretense of inquiring after her rheumatism. His surgery was warm and cluttered, the walls lined with old books and faded medical prints. He offered her tea and listened politely as she described her aches, but his attention was elsewhere, eyes straying to the window overlooking the green. "I worry, Jane," he confessed at last, "about what I didn't see, what I chose not to see. There were signs, perhaps, but nothing I could act upon. A bruise, a word spoken too sharply. I wrote it off as childhood clumsiness or a grieving mother's frustration. But now..." Miss Marple waited, letting the silence draw out. "She was a bright child, you know," Dr. Penrose continued. "Not as backward as some believed. She understood more than she let on. Sometimes I think she knew things she oughtn't. And now she's gone, and the whole village is tearing itself apart looking for someone to blame." Miss Marple reached out, squeezing his hand gently. "You did what you thought best. We all do until we learn otherwise. But sometimes, Doctor, it's the small things that matter, the detail in the dust." He looked at her, startled. "What do you mean?" "Only that every act, every word, can leave a trace. We must pay attention, even now, especially now." He nodded, subdued, and she left him gazing at the rain-speckled glass, haunted by the weight of his own uncertainties. 3. The Pilbeam. Fortress cracks that evening as dusk settled and the sky bruised with color. Mrs. Pilbeam made her way across the green, her posture more rigid than ever. She avoided every neighbor, her gaze fixed ahead until she reached the church. Miss Marple, out for her evening walk, followed at a respectful distance. Inside, the church was cool and dim, the air heavy with the scent of lilies. Mrs. Pilbeam knelt at the front pew, her hands clasped tightly. Miss Marple entered quietly, slipping into a pew behind her for several minutes. Only the faint creak of wood and the distant rustle of wings disturbed the silence. Then Mrs. Pilbeam spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "She was all I had left," she said, "but even I could not always reach her. It's my sister's child, left to me a burden. Yes, but one I never asked for." "Is that so wicked?" Miss Marple's heart ached at the rawness in her words. She stood and approached, sitting beside the grieving woman. "It is not wicked to feel burdened," Miss Marple said quietly. "Right, but it is dangerous to let that feeling fester. Children sense such things. They keep secrets when they are frightened, or when they think their troubles are too much for those who care for them." Mrs. Pilbeam's eyes glistened, but she blinked the tears away. "Do you think Alice was frightened of me?" "I think she was frightened of something. Perhaps not you, perhaps someone else, okay? But she was, above all, a child longing to be understood." For the first time, Mrs. Pilbeam's composure crumbled. She bowed her head, shoulders shaking in silent grief. Miss Marple sat beside her until the sobs subsided, offering comfort in her quiet, steady presence. For a tangle of motives, by nightfall, the village simmered with tension. The children's stories grew more elaborate, adult suspicions more pointed. Inspector Venn redoubled his efforts, but for every answer, 2 more questions emerged. Miss Marple, returning home under the first stars, made her nightly notes. Mrs. Pilbeam, overwhelmed and ashamed. Miss Dawes, frightened but steadfast. Dr. Penrose, guilty over missed signs. A village at war with itself. She stared out at the quiet streets, feeling the pressure of secrets mounting. Somewhere in all this tangle was the key to truth no one dared voice, but soon, she knew, something or someone would slip, and when that happened, the last defenses would fall. Chapter 4. A new shadow falls. If the first week after Alice's death was marked by sorrow and suspicion, the second began with a tension sharp enough to cut the June air. Inspector Venn, feeling the weight of the village's expectation and his own lack of progress, was up and about even before the baker's first loaves cooled. He had taken to pacing the lanes, making surprise visits, and so rumor had it sending word to county headquarters for assistance. But St. Aldhelm's, for all its unease, had begun to crave distraction. The ordinary routines, baking, gardening, the delivery of milk slowly resumed, but now, under a cloud, children were kept close, laughter subdued, as if any moment of carelessness might summon disaster. Miss Marple, meanwhile, watched as the invisible threads between her neighbors tightened and tangled further. There were too many stories, she thought, too many half-glimpsed secrets and unanswered questions. She felt it in the way Mrs. Chudley's voice trembled during the Sunday reading, in the haunted look that had settled behind Mrs. Pilbeam's eyes, and in the deliberate, careful silence of Miss Dawes. It was Monday morning when the twist came abrupt and unsettling. Stone dropped in still water. The missing ledger. The first to discover it was Mr. Jessup, who, after sweeping out his shop and arranging the day's bread, realized that the petty cash ledger was gone. It was not a valuable item in itself, but it was always kept on the counter behind the till, detailing every sale, every shilling spent or earned. He searched high and low, and when at last he asked his wife, she paled and hurried to the back room. There, behind a loose plank, they found the book, but several pages had been ripped out. The news spread with the speed of lightning. What reason could anyone have to take the ledger, and then, having found it, to tear out only a few select entries. Mrs. Jessup's voice rang out across the green, suspicions unfettered. Someone's hiding something, mark my words. Inspector Venn arrived promptly. He questioned the Jessups, examined the shop, and took the remaining pages for evidence. He then went round the neighboring cottages, asking if anyone had noticed anything amiss. But few would meet his eye, and those who did only shook their heads, anxious to appear innocent. Miss Marple, on her morning walk, paused outside the shop as the inspector left. He looked flustered, the usual calm of his features unsettled. "Morning, Miss Marple. Trouble, as you've no doubt heard. I gather something is missing," she replied. "Odd, isn't it? The things that disappear in a time like this." The inspector frowned. "You think it's connected?" "I think, Inspector, that secrets rarely travel alone. One brings another, and soon the pattern emerges." He offered a wan smile and moved on, but Miss Marple lingered, looking at the closed shop and the anxious faces peering out from behind its curtains. "I," a whisper from the past that afternoon. A second revelation swept through the village. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Chudley, was airing out old linens in the church vestry when she came upon an envelope, dressed in a delicate hand to the Reverend Chudley Private. She meant to leave it for her husband, but curiosity overcame her. Inside were several faded letters and a scrap of cloth of blue ribbon, frayed at the edge. Mrs. Chudley's gasp was audible halfway to the nave. She carried the envelope directly to the vicar. His face, upon reading the letters, turned first white, then a sickly gray. Together, they hurried to Inspector Venn, who took the contents into evidence and instructed them to speak to no one. But word of the discovery, if not its details, could not be contained. Soon the village was abuzz. Old love letters, scandalous, isn't it? Was it Alice's mother or someone else? That blue ribbon, wasn't there talk of one missing near where she was found? Miss Marple, who heard about the letters from Mrs. Blenkinsop, who had heard from the church cleaner, who had seen the vicar's face, was both troubled and intrigued. Why would such letters and such a ribbon turn up now? And why was Mrs. Pilbeam seen hurrying away from the church that very morning, her face blotched with tears? 3. The gathering storm. By evening, St. Aldhelm's was roiling with speculation. Some insisted the missing ledger and the letters were proof of a sordid affair. No wonder there was trouble in that family. Secrets never stay buried, you know. Others hinted darkly that Mrs. Pilbeam had threatened Alice's mother, or that Dr. Penrose's involvement went deeper than his brief as the village physician. Inspector Venn called an impromptu meeting in the church hall, hoping to quell the rumors and, perhaps, shake loose the truth. The room filled quickly, villagers on edge, eyes darting from neighbor to neighbor. Voices sharp and brittle. Venn spoke plainly. "We have reason to believe that the events of the fete and these new discoveries are connected. I implore anyone with information to come forward now. Even the smallest detail may be vital." He paused, waiting. The silence that followed was heavy and electric. Mrs. Pilbeam sat stiff and pale in the front row. Miss Dawes hovered by the door, Freddie clinging nervously to her sleeve. Dr. Penrose stood at the back, arms folded. The vicar and his wife sat close together, the envelope between them on the pew. At last, Mrs. Pilbeam rose. Her voice was tight, controlled, but the strain showed. "There is nothing more to say. My sister's life was her own. Alice was a good girl. Whatever those letters mean, they have nothing to do with her death." A ripple moved through the crowd. Miss Dawes stepped forward, hands trembling. "If I may, I saw Alice near the church that afternoon. She seemed frightened. She asked me about her mother, about something she'd overheard. I didn't know what to say. She was gone before I could comfort her. Another whisper surged. Alice was asking questions. "Okay, about what?" Vin pressed her. Did Alice mention anyone else? Anything about the blue ribbon or the fate? Miss Dawes shook her head, eyes filling with tears. "No, only," she said, she wanted to go home. She seemed lost, not just sad, but scared. Mrs. Blenkinsop leaped to her feet. "If there's secrets, it's not just in that family. We've all got things we'd rather keep hidden." The hall erupted in nervous laughter, a few bitter, a few bordering on hysteria. The inspector let the noise run its course, and at last the room fell silent. He spoke again. "This is no longer about one child or one family. There's a thread here that ties us all together. I will find it." For Miss Marple's private reflection that night, as the village tried to settle, Miss Marple sat in her dim-lit parlor, blue ribbon in one hand, the chipped button in the other, the ledger, the letters, the ribbon, the button-all fragments of a pattern just beyond reach. She recalled Alice's silence, her questions, her last desperate attempt to speak. And she wondered, with quiet certainty, whether the real truth had not yet even begun to surface. The case had taken a turn, and so had the village itself. New shadow had fallen one cast, not just by the crime, but by the secrets so long buried that now, at last, threatened to burst into the light. Miss Marple closed her notebook, set down her tea, and gazed into the night. The real test, she knew, was only just beginning. A subtle game in the days after the church hall meeting. St. Aldhelm's was no longer merely a village. It had become a place under siege by memory, suspicion, and the restless, searching gaze of its own people. Every routine seemed fraught with tension, every friendly greeting stiff with the unspoken knowledge that something monstrous still lingered. Among them, Inspector Venn patrolled the lanes, his notebook filling with half-facts and contradictions. The vicar and his wife kept their curtains tightly drawn. Mr. Jessup installed a new lock on the shop's storeroom, looking at each customer with quiet suspicion. Even the weather had changed, a muggy heat settling over the cottages, as if the world itself waited for THUNDERCLAP. Miss Marple, however, seemed her usual self-calm, unhurried, and perpetually in the right place at the right time. If she noticed the sharp glances and muttered questions trailing in her wake, she gave no sign. She kept to her gentle walks, her knitting, her soft inquiries. But inside, her mind was restless, each clue and whisper tumbling over the next in search of a pattern that made sense. It was the blue ribbon, still on her parlor table, that returned to her thoughts as she watched the village twist itself into knots. She wondered, not for the first time, about the psychology of secrets, how people behave when pressed, when frightened, when the careful order of their world is threatened. And so, with characteristic subtlety, she devised a little test. I.T. At the vicarage, Miss Marple began by inviting Mrs. Pilbeam, Miss Dawes, Dr. Penrose, and the vicar's wife for tea at the vicarage. Her invitation was worded as only Miss Marple could manage. It does us all good, in times like these, to remember small kindnesses, to perhaps share our burdens in gentle company. The group assembled on a sticky afternoon, the vicar's wife bustling with teapots and plates of seed cake, trying to project normalcy even as her eyes darted nervously about the room. Miss Dawes arrived last, Freddie at her side, clutching a school book as if it were a shield. Mrs. Pilbeam, drawn and tight-lipped, took the seat nearest the window and refused refreshment. Dr. Penrose looked everywhere but at the others, his polite conversation practiced and hollow. Miss Marple steered the conversation with practiced ease, asking after gardens, parish events, the weather, ever quite touching the dark heart of the gathering, yet never entirely leaving it behind. She spoke of the fate of little moments. She remembered how lovely the maypole had looked, How fine Mrs. Chudley's baking had tasted. How Alice had been seen with her blue ribbon. The effect was immediate but varied. Mrs. Pilbeam stiffened, one hand clenching her skirt. Miss Dawes's eyes widened, flickering toward Mrs. Pilbeam, then to her nephew. Dr. Penrose sipped his tea and said nothing, but the knuckles of his hand turned white on the cup. The vicar's wife glanced at her husband, and then at the plate of ribbon sandwiches with a sudden, inexplicable distress. Miss Marple made a show of tidying her knitting, withdrawing a small envelope from her basket. "I do hope," she said, "that whoever left this blue ribbon in the church will come forward. It's such a pretty thing, really. Sentimental value, perhaps. I should hate for it to be lost." There was a breathless moment as she placed the ribbon, folded delicately, in the center of the tea table. No one spoke. Mrs. Pilbeam's lips parted, then pressed tight again. Miss Dawes reached out for her teacup and nearly knocked it over. Freddie looked at his shoes. Dr. Penrose, finally, broke the silence with a weak chuckle. "Children lose things all the time. My own sister used to drop half her wardrobe from the hedges." "Yes, but such things can mean a great deal in the right hands," Miss Marple replied. "Children, especially lonely ones, hold on to tokens for comfort. Sometimes they even use them to send messages." Her words hovered in the air, seemingly casual, but sharp as a pen. The vicar's wife, unable to bear the tension, abruptly excused herself, tears glistening in her eyes. The others sat in a silence, thick with old wounds and unanswered questions. "Aye, a walk in the heat after tea." Miss Marple strolled home by way of the churchyard, pretending to examine the roses blooming against the weathered stones. She paused at the yew where Alice had been found. Someone had left wildflowers there, their stems already wilting in the heat. She was not alone for long. Miss Dawes caught up to her, her face pale, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Marple, why? Did you mention the ribbon? Did you find it in the church?" Miss Marple nodded, regarding her gently. "It was handed in. Seemed worth mentioning." Miss Dawes hesitated, tears welling. "Alice asked about her mother, you know. She said she'd found something, a letter, a ribbon, but she thought it meant her mother was coming back, or had left her a message. I told her not to worry, but she seemed haunted. And now," her voice broke, "I wish I'd done more, say." Marple offered her hand, which Miss Dawes gripped tightly. "It did what you could. But perhaps now, with so much at stake, someone else will remember a small kindness, or a small cruelty, that will help set things right." Miss Dawes nodded, then hurried away, shoulders hunched. 3. The inspector's visit that evening, as dusk thickened and a restless wind stirred the trees. Inspector Venn paid Miss Marple a call. He was tired, harried, his collar askew. "I must say, Mrs. Marple, you have a way of unsettling my suspects. Word of your tea has gone round the village like wildfire." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Times a little discomfort shakes loose the truth." He nodded. Then, more quietly, "We have the results from the lab." There were traces of a sleeping draft in Alice's blood. Nothing deadly in itself, just enough to make her drowsy, perhaps too drowsy to call for help. Miss Marple's eyes clouded. So it was not merely fright or misadventure. Someone gave her something. The inspector sighed. "That's what it looks like. The doctor claims he hasn't prescribed anything like that recently, not to Mrs. Pilbeam nor to anyone else connected to the family, but such things are easy to come by." Miss Marple pondered this new information. "I wonder, Inspector, if you might ask the vicar's wife about the linens she found. Sometimes small tokens, ribbons, buttons are hidden in places meant to keep them safe. But secrets, once uncovered, rarely stay silent." He promised he would, then took his leave, glancing back at her cottage as if hoping for one last useful observation. Miss Marple simply wished him good night, for the frayed edges alone Once more, Miss Marple sat with her knitting in her lap, her mind tracing each interaction, every glance and hesitation at tea. The blue ribbon, the missing button, the sleeping draft. The ledger with its torn-out pages, all threads in a tapestry whose shape she was only just beginning to discern. She recalled how Mrs. Pilbeam had trembled when the ribbon was mentioned, how Dr. Penrose avoided her eye, how Miss Dawes's guilt seemed to deepen by the hour. But above all, she thought of Alice, brave enough to ask questions, quiet enough to keep the wrong secrets, and innocent enough to trust where trust should not have been given. The village was holding its breath, and so was she. Miss Marple set down her knitting and gazed into the gathering dark, knowing that her gentle game had shifted the balance. Somewhere among those fraying threads, the truth would come unraveled very soon. Chapter 5. The Reveal. Draws near the air in St. Aldhelm's had grown heavier, almost tangible with anticipation. Each morning arrived, wrapped in a fog of whispered fears and guarded glances. Lee, once so sure of itself in its gentle routines, was now uncertain and brittle, as if at any moment the carefully constructed order might shatter altogether. Inspector Venn's visits were more frequent, his questions sharper. The vicar's pews grew emptier, the church bells tolling in a somber rhythm that echoed the villagers' unease. Even the children's laughter was tempered, strained by the knowledge that a shadow still hung over them, a shadow whose edges remained indistinct but no less menacing. Miss Marple observed all of this from her accustomed window seat, knitting, paused in her lap as she contemplated the slow unraveling. Her mind worked steadily, fitting the disparate pieces into a clearer picture, though she knew the final thread would take patience to pull. A new discovery. It was a chance remark by the postmistress, Mrs. Pevensey, that sent Miss Marple in pursuit of fresh leads. Over a cup of tea in the shop, Mrs. Pevensey confided quietly that she had noticed an unusual correspondence arriving at the Pilbeam cottage weeks before the fatila darts that were burned hastily after delivery, but not before their scent lingered faintly of lavender and something acrid. The sort of scent you might find in an old chemist's shop, Mrs. Pevensey said, wrinkling her nose. I asked the carrier about it, but he only shrugged. So the letters were special and meant to be kept private. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. The scent reminded her of the laudanum Dr. Penrose had prescribed, and she wondered if there was more to the secret letters than mere sentimentality. 2. The ledger's missing pages. Meanwhile, Inspector Venn had uncovered more about the missing ledger. A few torn pages had been discovered in the bushes near the churchyard, soaked and stained, but partially legible. They revealed a series of payments to an unknown individual, payments marked with vague descriptions: consultation, special, service, confidential. The sums were small but regular, and the handwriting was unfamiliar to the inspector. Miss Marple pondered these findings carefully. Money changing hands in secret could be the key to unlocking hidden motives, and old wounds. The village turns word of the discoveries spread quickly, igniting a new wave of speculation. Mrs. Blenkinsop took every opportunity to insinuate that the secrets of the Pilbeam family were deeper than anyone dared admit, while Mr. Jessup quietly warned the more sensible villagers to be cautious in their judgments. In the market square, Miss Marple overheard a conversation between two elderly women. It's not just the family, one said. These things always have roots in the past, sins, long buried, dragging new generations down. Her companion nodded. And the vicar's family too, some say. Those letters, who knows what skeletons they're hiding. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the blue ribbon, the chipped button, the hidden letters, and the torn ledger pages. Each was a piece of a puzzle that only now was beginning to take shape. IV. Confronting the past late that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the vicar and his wife. The couple received her with a mixture of relief and caution. Mrs. Shelley's eyes were red-rimmed. Her composure remained intact. "I understand you have some questions about the letters," the vicar said quietly, guiding Miss Marple to a small sitting room. "They were my wife's letters from her past, long before she came to St. Aldhelm's." Mrs. Chudley nodded, adding they concerned a secret, something she hoped would never come to light. When Alice came into our lives, she became intertwined in that secret, though she never knew it fully. Miss Marple listened intently as the vicar recounted a tale of a broken engagement, a betrayal, and a promise to keep certain facts hidden for the sake of a child's innocence. "It seems," Miss Marple mused, "that these past shadows have stretched far beyond their origin, touching lives in unexpected ways." The vicar sighed deeply. "Yes, and now the past threatens to swallow us all." An unexpected visitor that evening. A knock came at Miss Marple's door. It was Freddie Dawes, pale and nervous, clutching a small bundle wrapped in cloth. I wanted to give you this," he stammered, holding out the package. "I found it near the yew tree. I thought maybe it would help." Miss Marple accepted the bundle gently and carefully unwrapped it. Inside lay a worn diary, its pages fragile but still legible. The handwriting was neat but tentative, as though the author was a young girl struggling to find her voice. "I think it belonged to Alice," Freddie said, voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple's heart stirred. Here, perhaps, was the voice that had been silent for so long. The diary's secret that night. Alone in her sitting room, Miss Marple read by lamplight. The diary was filled with fragments observations about the village, feelings of loneliness, hopes, and fears. Among the entries were references to the tall shadow and whispers in the night, hints at a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. One passage caught her eye. "I wish Auntie would listen. I'm scared of the man who comes when the light fades. He never speaks, but I see his eyes." The words sent a chill through her. Who was this shadow? How had Alice come to fear him so deeply? 7. The village holds its breaths. The days lengthen toward midsummer. St. Aldhelm's waited, some with dread, others with grim determination for the truth to emerge. The inspector's inquiries grew more insistent, the villagers' stories more tangled. Miss Marple knew that soon the delicate balance would tip. The revelations contained in Alice's diary, coupled with the newly uncovered evidence, meant the moment of reckoning was approaching. She closed the diary and set it carefully aside, ready to watch as the village's quiet masks began to fall away. The unraveling the morning of the village meeting dawned pale and misty, the kind of quiet that pressed on the soul and made every breath seem heavier. St. Aldhelm's had never seen a gathering like this, not in memory, not in stories past. From one generation to the next, the church hall, usually a place of cheerful fetes and gentle concerts, was transformed into a chamber of reckoning. Villagers arrived in clusters, faces drawn and voices low. Mrs. Pilbeam sat stiffly near the front, her eyes shadowed but unwavering. Miss Dawes hovered near the door, clutching her coat as though it might shield her from the weight of what was to come. Dr. Penrose and Inspector Venn took their places at the head of the room, the latter's notebook closed, but his eyes sharp. Anticipating Miss Marple entered last, her arrival unnoticed by most but felt keenly by those who knew her. She settled into a chair near the center, knitting bag at her feet, the faintest trace of a smile upon her lips. To the casual observer, she was simply the village's beloved auntie. To those who looked closer, she was the calm eye within a gathering storm. Setting the stage, Inspector Venn began with a brief summary of the investigation, the missing ledger pages, the mysterious letters, the sleeping draft found in Alice's system. He spoke plainly, avoiding speculation but clearly signaling that the case was more complex than any had imagined. When he finished, he looked to Miss Marple. "Mrs. Marple, I believe you have something to share with us." She nodded gracefully and rose to speak, her voice soft but carrying the weight of quiet authority. I thank you all for coming. It is a difficult thing to face the truth, especially when it involves those we know, those we think we understand. But the truth is not a thing to fear. It is a light that, while it may sting at first, ultimately brings clarity and peace. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. Alice Pilbeam was a child of great sensitivity and intelligence, more aware of her surroundings than many gave her credit for. She was silent, not because she could not speak, but because she feared what speaking might bring. A murmur passed through the crowd. Miss Marple raised a hand. Please, let me explain. 2. The puzzle pieces. Miss Marple unfolded the threads of the mystery carefully, like the delicate stitches of a tapestry. Some weeks before the fete, Alice found letters, hidden away letters, between the vicar's wife and a man whose name was never spoken aloud here. These letters contained secrets of the past, including a broken engagement and a child who was never acknowledged. Alice, curious and brave, sought answers. She glanced briefly at Mrs. Chudley, who did not flinch. Alice also kept a diary, found by young Freddie Dawes, which told of a tall figure who frightened her, who came at dusk, silent but menacing. This figure is no phantom of the imagination, but a person very much real, whose presence terrified a little girl. Miss Marple held up the blue ribbon and the chipped button, letting them catch the light. These were found near the yew tree where Alice was last seen. The button belongs to a garment not worn by a child, but by a woman. Okay. The ribbon was a token Alice treasured, a symbol of hope, or perhaps a message. She turned to Dr. Penrose. Doctor, you noted bruises on Alice last year and prescribed treatments for nervous complaints. Were you aware of anything else troubling the child? The doctor nodded slowly, voice heavy with regret. I suspected she was frightened, but I could not prove who or what. I'm sorry that I did not do more. 3. The confrontation. Miss Marple then addressed Mrs. Pilbeam, her tone gentle but firm. Mrs. Pilbeam, grief is a powerful thing, and so is guilt, but protecting those we love sometimes blinds us to the truth. Alice was afraid not of you, but perhaps of what she sensed around her. The room was silent, the tension palpable. Mrs. Pilbeam, Miss Marple continued. Do you know of the man who visited the cottage on several occasions in the months before Alice's death? Mrs. Pilbeam's lips trembled, but she nodded. Double quotes. Yes, my late sister's husband. I had hoped he would keep away, but he did not. Miss Marple's eyes held hers. He was the tall shadow Alice feared. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Pilbeam's composure cracked. She looked away, voice breaking. He was troubled. I tried to protect Alice, but he was persistent. For the truth emerges. Inspector Venn stepped forward. The man, John Hemsworth, had a history of violence and had been recently released from prison. He sought to reclaim ties to the family, but was rejected. He held up a photograph, projecting it for all to see, the gaunt face of a man whose eyes were hard and haunted. He was seen near the village in the days before the fete. It was likely the one who administered the sleeping draught to Alice, rendering her helpless. Miss Marple nodded. Alice's fear was well-founded, yet she tried to keep the peace, to shield those she loved from the consequences of truth. The aftermath. The villagers sat in stunned silence, the fragile web of their lives shattered and reshaped. Some wept openly. Others bowed their heads. In quiet reflection, Mrs. Pilbeam finally spoke, voice raw. I failed her. I did not protect my niece as I should have. For that, I will bear the shame and sorrow. Miss Dawes, her eyes red, added softly. Alice's voice was never loud, but it was strong in her own way. We must remember her courage. Miss Marple, sitting once more, closed her knitting. In a village like ours, the quiet ones often. See most clearly. It is our duty now to listen and to learn. Chapter 6. Quiet Reflections. The Village of St. Aldhelms. Once so serene and assured, now moved through its days like a town caught in a slow tide pulled between shock and the fragile hope of healing. The revelation of the truth had been like a stone cast into still waters, its ending ripples that reached even the quietest corners of the community. The church bells tolled their familiar hours, yet their sound seemed tinged with a new solemnity. The villagers, bound by grief and remorse, gathered in small groups to talk, to remember, and to seek some measure of peace. Even the air, heavy with summer blooms, carried a wistful sadness that seemed to press softly against each heart. Miss Marple, for her part, settled back into her usual rhythm, but with a weight more profound than any ordinary day. She took her morning walks, visiting the places where shadows once lurked and where light now cautiously returned. She stopped by the yew tree on the church green, now ringed with fresh flowers, and laid a sprig of lavender, her own small tribute to the girl who had never spoken aloud her pain. The village. Gathers the village hall hosted a gathering this time, not of accusation or suspicion, but of remembrance and support. Mrs. Pilbeam, fragile yet dignified, stood before her neighbors and spoke of Alice with a tenderness that pierced the collective heart. "I failed to protect her," she said quietly, "but I ask you to remember Alice, not for her silence, but for her courage and kindness." Miss Dawes, too, spoke. Her voice was steadier now, marked by a quiet strength. "Alice's story is a lesson for us all that sometimes the most vulnerable hold the greatest truths." The community responded with nods, tears, and a shared resolve to be kinder, more attentive, more forgiving. 2. Healing in small things, Miss Marple observed, as old grievances softened and new bonds formed. The vicar and his wife extended gentle reconciliations to those long estranged. Dr. Penrose, ever the humble healer, offered his services freely to the villagers. Seeking redemption in Caridot. In the bakery, Mr. Jessup served bread with a new warmth in his eyes, while Mrs. Blenkinsop, once sharp-tongued and suspicious, lent a hand to Mrs. Pilbeam's garden. Both women finding unexpected comfort in shared labor. Miss Marple smiled to herself at these small acts. Healing, she thought, is not a great flood, but a quiet rain seeped slowly into the roots. 3. Private contemplations in the quiet of her sitting room. Miss Marple reflected on the tangled paths that had led to Alice's tragedy. She thought of the village's secrets, its kindness, its frailty, in the many faces she had come to know so well. She recalled the sharp edges, Mrs. Pilbeam's guarded sorrow, Miss Dawes's quiet courage, Dr. Penrose's regrets, and the inscrutable fears of a child too wise for her years. Each had played a part in a story both simple and complex, where silence often spoke louder than words. She thought, too, of human nature, its capacity for both cruelty and compassion, for secrecy and revelation. People, she mused softly, are like old gardens, full of hidden roots and buried treasures, with the strength to bloom anew if given the chance. 4. A letter arrives one afternoon as she was tending her window boxes. A letter arrived sealed with neat, unfamiliar handwriting. Miss Marple recognized it instantly. A note from the vicar's wife. She read it carefully, spoke of thanks for her steadfast presence, of hope for the future, and of a small request that the village remember Alice not as a victim, but as a beginner reminder to listen more closely, to care more deeply, and to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it on her mantelpiece, the words lingering like a promise. A new dawn. The days lengthened and softened as summer deepened. The village green, once the scene of tragedy, blossomed with wildflowers and children's laughter. The maypole, repaired and freshly painted, stood proud once more. Miss Marple sat beneath its ribbons one afternoon, knitting quietly as the sun filtered through the linden leaves. She watched the villagers, some new faces, mingling with old friends. Sand felt a gentle peace settle over her, though the wounds of the past were slow to heal. The village had taken its first steps forward, and in the quiet, she knew that truth. And kindness would continue to grow slowly, patiently, and surely. New questions arise. Summer had settled over St. Aldhelm's, casting golden light over its ancient stone cottages and verdant lanes. On the surface, life appeared to have returned to something like normalcy. Children played beneath the sprawling linden trees. The maypole's ribbons fluttered in the breeze, and the village shop buzzed quietly with its familiar bustle. Yet beneath this calm, as subtle as the shifting shadows at dusk, new questions began to stir, questions that refused to rest even as the village sought to heal. Miss Marple, ever attentive, sensed these undercurrents with a quiet certainty. It was not the loud disputes or obvious suspicions that troubled her now, but the faintest hesitations, the slight changes in tone when neighbors met, and the unexplained silences that lingered longer than usual. A letter, unsent. The first hint came with the discovery of a letter in the vicarage, tucked behind an old book on the shelf, a letter unsigned and never posted. Miss Marple, who had been visiting the vicar's wife to offer companionship, was shown the note by Mrs. Chudley herself, her hands trembling slightly. It was addressed to no one, or rather, to someone who never received it. Mrs. Chudley said softly, "I found it quite by accident while cleaning." The letter was brief, penned in a delicate hand, and spoke of fear and hope, pleading for understanding and mercy. It hinted at a secret too painful to share aloud, yet too urgent to forget. Miss Marple read it twice, her brow furrowed. "Do you think it might be from your past?" she asked gently. Mrs. Chudley nodded, eyes distant. "Yes, but I cannot say more. It feels as though some part of that past is still very close, still watching." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. Secrets that linger are like shadows. They stretch far and sometimes fall where we least expect. To unease among friends as days passed, subtle fissures began appearing among the villagers. Mrs. Blenkinsop, once content to sow gossip from a distance, became more outspoken in her doubts, questioning even those who had once stood above suspicion. At the Women's Institute meeting, which was usually a haven of polite chatter and recipe swaps, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Mrs. Blenkinsop challenged Miss Dawes's version of events, hinting that the schoolmistress had her own reasons to hide certain facts. Her words were sharp but veiled, drawing uneasy glances from the younger women. Miss Dawes, usually reserved, responded with quiet dignity. But Miss Marple noticed the strain in her voice and the pale circles beneath her eyes. The village, it seemed, had not forgotten the shadows of the past, nor the weight of judgment. 3. A mysterious visitor. One afternoon, an unfamiliar figure arrived in St. Aldhelm's, man in his early 40s, sharply dressed and with a keen, scrutinizing gaze. He introduced himself as Mr. Harrow, an investigator from the county police, sent at Inspector Venn's request to assist with ongoing inquiries. Miss Marple observed the newcomer with interest. He was polite but brisk, his questions probing and direct. He spoke with villagers, examining records, and speaking privately with the vicar and Mrs. Pilbeam. The atmosphere thickened. Rumors began circulating. Was Mr. Harrow here because the case was more serious than anyone realized? Had new evidence come to light? Was the village's fragile peace about to be disturbed once more? For Miss Marple's quiet inquiry imperturbed, Miss Marple continued her own subtle inquiries. She revisited the blue ribbon, now carefully preserved in a glass case at the vicarage, and reflected on the chipped button she had kept all along. Walking through the village one evening, she stopped at the bakery and exchanged a few quiet words with Mr. Jessup. "Any new talk, Mr. Jessup?" she asked. He shook his head, though his eyes betrayed a restlessness. "Not much, but I hear some whisper about the Pilbeam cottage. Something about visitors late at night. Shadows moving when no one should be about." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Old houses often hold old secrets, but sometimes it's the visitors who bring new ones." A chance encounter later that week. As Miss Marple strolled near the churchyard, she encountered Mrs. Pilbeam coming hurriedly from a neighbor's cottage. The older woman looked more fragile than ever, her shoulders stooped and her gaze flickering nervously. "Mrs. Pilbeam," Miss Marple greeted softly, "I hope you are finding some comfort among your friends." Mrs. Pilbeam shook her head. "I fear the village grows less kind by the day. The whispers, the stares, it wears on a woman." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "The path of truth is never easy, but you are not alone." Their conversation was interrupted by the sudden arrival of Mr. Harrow, who greeted Mrs. Pilbeam warmly but with an unmistakable edge. "Mrs. Pilbeam," he said, "I wonder if we might speak privately. There are a few matters I would like to clarify." Mrs. Pilbeam hesitated, then nodded slowly. The night before that evening, Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting needles resting lightly in her hands. The village lay quiet beneath the canopy of stars, the soft rustle of leaves carrying memories of days past and hopes for days yet to come. Her thoughts wandered over the tangled web of relationships and secrets, fears spoken and unspoken, the unsent letter, the mysterious visitor, the restless village all signs that beneath the calm surface new questions were gathering strength. She sighed softly, a gentle smile touching her lips. "The heart of a village," she mused, "is much like the heart of a person, complex, vulnerable, and ever seeking the light." The night deepened, and with it, the promise that the next day might bring fresh revelations, answers, perhaps, but certainly new mysteries to be unraveled. Chapter 7. Turning points. The mornings in St. Altelms had grown quieter, almost painfully. So, the usual bustle of villagers meeting at the bakery or gathering around the post office had thinned, replaced by furtive glances and conversations whispered behind closed doors. Though the summer sun cast a warm glow over the village's stone cottages and winding lanes, it could not brighten the shadows that now clung to every corner. Miss Marple felt it keenly, the sense that the balance of calm had tipped, that the intricate web of secrets was fraying at its edges. The arrival of Mr. Harrow had unsettled many, and even Inspector Venn, typically composed, wore the strain of mounting pressure. A visit to the vicarage. Miss Marple decided to visit the vicarage one late morning, hoping to speak with Mrs. Chudley once more. The vicar's wife received her in the sitting room, a place filled with faded photographs and delicate china, yet now tinged with an air of solemnity. "I am grateful for your visit, Mrs. Marple," Mrs. Chudley said softly, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. "There are things I wish I had said sooner, but fear and shame silenced me." Miss Marple settled into her chair. "Sometimes it takes time to find the courage for truth." Mrs. Chudley nodded, eyes moist. "The letters you saw a day were part of a story I tried to bury, my past with John Hemsworth, the man who haunted the Pilbeam family. He was a secret I hoped would remain forgotten." She paused, gathering strength. He wanted to reclaim what he thought was his revenge, perhaps. But he was dangerous, and Alice knew more than she should. She tried to protect others by her silence, but in doing so, she sealed her own fate. Miss Marple's gaze was steady, and yet she spoke in other ways through her diary, through those small signs that were missed or ignored. Mrs. Chudley sighed. "I feared the village's wounds run deeper than I understood." 2. A meeting at the bakery later that afternoon. Miss Marple found herself in the bakery where Mr. Jessup was arranging fresh bread on the shelves. The shop smelled of yeast and warmth, but even here, unease lingered. "You seem quieter than usual, Mr. Jessup," Miss Marple remarked. He chuckled dryly. We all are, these days. The village's patience wears thin. Some folks want answers, others want to forget. Neither is easy. Miss Marple glanced toward the door, where Mrs. Blenkinsop stood, chatting with a few neighbors. Her voice, low but intense. "She's been stirring the pot again," Mr. Jessup said, lowering his voice. "And some listen too well." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Gossip is a double-edged blade. It can cut through pretense, but it can also wound the innocent." 3. A surprise confession that evening, as twilight deepened over the village. Miss Marple was visited by Dr. Penrose. His face was grave, his movements less assured than usual. "I've come to confess something," he said, settling into a chair. "I was reluctant to speak before, fearing scandal and pain, but it is time." Miss Marple listened attentively as he revealed that months before Alice's death, he had treated her for injuries more severe than previously disclosed bruises, consistent with harsh treatment. He had reported concerns to Mrs. Pilbeam, but was met with denial and silence. "I feared what might happen if I pressed further," he admitted, voice heavy. "Now I regret that hesitation." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "You acted as you could within your role, but the past will always catch up, especially when it touches the vulnerable." 4. The inspectors renewed pursuit the following day. Inspector Venn and Mr. Harrow intensified their inquiries. They revisited the Pilbeam cottage, questioned neighbors anew, and combed through village records with fresh eyes. Rumor swirled that the man named John Hemsworth had been spotted near the village again not long before the fete. Some claimed to have seen him lurking near the churchyard. Others whispered of a late-night confrontation. The villagers, though weary, grew restless. Some demanded swift justice. Others feared the consequences of exposing long-buried secrets. Miss Marple's quiet determination missed the growing tension. Miss Marple maintained her steady watch. She returned off into the churchyard, tracing the worn paths and lingering at the yew tree. The blue ribbon still gleamed faintly in her memory. The chipped button, a quiet symbol of truths waiting to be claimed. She thought of Alice Silent, brave, a child caught in the currents of adult failings. Miss Marple's fingers moved over her knitting, mind weaving new patterns, connecting dots overlooked. The time was near. The delicate threads were taut soon, she knew. The final piece would fall into place. The final unraveling. The village of St. Aldhelms held its breath. The days were heavy with expectancy, and the usual rhythms felt stretched thin, like the taut strings of a harp waiting for the first note to shatter the silence. In every face, Miss Marple saw the flicker of something unspoken. Hope mingled with fear. Suspicion mingled with the desperate desire for peace. Miss Marple herself moved, with quiet purpose, knitting bag in hand, observing as the subtle dynamics of the village shifted once more. The steady approach of Inspector Venn and Mr. Harrow was felt in every corner, their inquiries growing more insistent, more focused. And somewhere beneath it all, a fragile truth lay just out of reach, waiting to be coaxed into the light. Revisiting the past. Miss Marple spent a reflective morning at the churchyard, where the yew tree stood sentinel over the soft earth. The wildflowers placed in Alice's memory had begun to wilt, but the sadness they symbolized was evergreen. The blue ribbon, safely preserved in the vicarage, had become a symbol of the delicate thread connecting past to present. Chipped button, tucked carefully in Miss Marple's pocket, was a reminder of the small details that others overlooked, but which often held the key to understanding. She thought of the diary, Alice's silent voice, whose words had been the first clear call for help, the tall shadow, the whispered fears, the quiet bravery, all pieces of a puzzle now nearing completion. 2. A gathering of witnesses. That afternoon, Inspector Venn called a meeting at the village hall, this time not only to report findings, but to hear from the villagers themselves. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with anticipation. One by one, the villagers came forward. Some spoke haltingly, others with veiled resentment or regret. Miss Marple watched closely, noting every hesitation, every glance exchanged. Mrs. Pilbeam was present, her face pale but composed. Miss Dawes sat beside her, hands folded tightly in her lap. Dr. Penrose was there, as were Mr. Jessup, Mrs. Blenkinsop, and a handful of other villagers, each bearing pieces of the story in their memories. The truth emerges. The turning point came when a young woman stepped forward, a new face, recently arrived in the village. She spoke of having seen John Hemsworth near the churchyard shortly before the fete. Her voice trembled as she described a heated argument between him and Mrs. Pilbeam. "I didn't know what to do," she said, eyes wide. "He was angry, shouting about debts and old wrongs. I heard him say he'd get what was owed, no matter what." The room stirred, the silence breaking into murmurs of shock and disbelief. Inspector Venn seized the moment. "Does anyone else have information about this?" Several voices rose, hesitant but growing stronger. Details of late-night visits, threats whispered behind closed doors. In the heavy presence of fear filled the hall. Confronting the culprit with the village gathered. And the evidence mounting, the inspector turned to Mrs. Pilbeam. "Mrs. Pilbeam, the evidence suggests that John Hemsworth's return to St. Aldhelm's brought danger not only to you, but to Alice. Your silence may have been protective, but it cannot continue." Mrs. Pilbeam's face crumpled, tears flowing freely. "Wanted to protect them all from the past, from the pain. But I was wrong." Miss Marple spoke then, her voice calm and steady. "Sometimes protection means speaking the truth, no matter how painful." Alice's silence was her attempt to shield you. "Now it is our duty to honor her by bringing justice." The inspector nodded. "John Hemsworth has been located and taken into custody. The case will proceed accordingly." The village breathed relief, mingled with sorrow, as the villagers absorbed the news. The weight of uncertainty lifted, replaced by a tentative hope. Miss Dawes reached for Mrs. Pilbeam's hand, a gesture of forgiveness and solidarity. Dr. Penrose exhaled deeply, the burden of unspoken regrets lightening. Miss Marple sat quietly, knitting in hand, her gaze steady. She knew the journey was far from over. Healing would take time, but for now, the village could begin to breathe again. Chapter 8: Aftermath and Renewal. The village of St. Aldhelm's awoke slowly to a new dawn. The weight that had pressed so heavily upon its people began to ease, as though a long, suffocating winter had finally given way to a tentative spring. The air carried a softness now, the light through the linden leaves gentler and more forgiving. The events that had shaken the village, the death of Alice Pilbeam, the tangled secrets, and the painful truth finally uncovered, left behind scars, of course, but they also sparked something more subtle, a sense of renewal, a cautious hope that from the darkness might come growth. Miss Marple watched all of this with her usual quiet grace, knitting back at her side, her sharp mind weaving the strands of experience into a tapestry of indirect tandingi. The village moves forward. The church bells, once heavy with sorrow, now rang with a clear, bright tone. The villagers began to emerge more openly, voices no longer hushed or fearful, but tentative and earnest. The market square saw renewed life, with neighbors greeting one another with something like warmth rather than mere civility. Mrs. Pilbeam, though still fragile, was embraced by the community with a gentle compassion. She had faced her past and her mistakes, and now sought to rebuild what had been broken. Miss Dawes, too, found renewed strength. Her pale eyes no longer flickered with fear, but shone with determination. She resumed her duties at the school with renewed purpose, committed to nurturing not only young minds but young hearts as well. Dr. Penrose, once weighed down by regret, redoubled his care for the villagers. His presence, steady and reassuring, became a balm for many who had suffered silently. Aye. Small acts of kindness. Miss Marple found comfort in the small moments, the offering of a loaf of bread by Mr. Jessup to Mrs. Pilbeam, the sharing of a basket of fresh herbs from one garden to another, the laughter of children weaving through the lanes as they chased each other in games. She herself took to visiting those who were lonely or troubled, offering gentle words and a listening ear. She understood that healing was not a great flood, but a quiet rain, was falling softly, seeping into the roots where it was most needed. Reflections in the quiet and the calm of her sitting room one evening. Miss Marple sat by the window, the twilight casting long shadows across her knitting. She thought deeply of the journey the village had taken from the first shock of tragedy through the tangled thicket of secrets to the fragile clearing of truth. People, she mused, were like gardens, rich and complex, sometimes tangled and thorny, often beautiful when tended with care. They hid their wounds beneath layers of soil, but with patience and kindness, they could bloom again. She recalled Alice, the girl who never spoke aloud, but whose quiet courage had changed the village. Alice's silence had been both shield and signal, reminder that sometimes the loudest truths come from those who speak least. The last threads. Miss Marple took up her knitting once more, fingers moving steadily. Each stitch was a small act of creation, a symbol of continuity and hope. As the night deepened, she placed the finished piece of delicate scarf, woven in soft blues and grays beside her. She smiled softly, knowing that, like her knitting, the village's story was one of many threads, some frayed, some strong, all woven together in the fabric of life. The village would never forget Alice, nor the lessons her silence had taught them. But they could move forward, carrying her memory with them in the quiet strength she had shown.